You're listening to sermons from La Cañada Congregational Church and Pastor Kyle Sears. Join us in person every Sunday at 10 a.m. in La Cañada for worship. You can find more information about our church online at lacañadachurch.org.
So as a kid, I was pretty terrible at sports, and so I focused all of my attention into academics. And so every year, our county fair would have an academic decathlon for 8th graders. Teams of 4, the smartest kids in each school. And my little country bumpkin school put me and my twin brother and a couple of our friends on it. And my brother's focus was going to be math, mine history. And they gave us some sample problems, and questions that you might be asked during this thing, about 250 for each category. And rather than, perfecting our capacity to hit a baseball, we decided just to really drill down on these questions. Rigorously studying, making our own problems up, anything to avoid going outside and playing baseball. And so each team had a buzzer. The MC would read the question. You'd write it down and buzz in whenever you had the answer. Except what we found very early on is that the MC wasn't just providing us with questions that were different from what was given to us to study, but they were the exact same math problems, to which, at the very beginning of the math problem being stated, we knew the answers. Buzzing in, 4,216, that's correct. And then realizing, we need to make it at least look like we're doing the math in our head quickly, so it would be, sort of scratching our chin and wondering. We blew the other teams out of the water. If you thought that being terrible at catching pop-up flies was embarrassing, imagine having memorized 250 math problems as a 14-year-old and thinking that was anything remotely cool. We walked off the stage feeling very proud of ourselves, only to realize, no one likes that. So you've probably got your own embarrassing stories to tell, some that maybe give you a deep sense of shame when you reflect on them. That's kind of the place that the Philippian church is, as Paul is writing to them, is trying to draw out from them this sense of who they are and maybe reframing a little bit of their shameful stories. And so this is Philippians chapter 1, verses 1 through 11. This is a letter, so it opens, Paul and Timothy, the servants of Christ Jesus, to all the saints in Christ Jesus who are in Philippi, along with the bishops and deacons. Grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. I thank my God for every remembrance of you, always in every one of my prayers for all of you, praying with joy for your partnership in the gospel from the first day until now. I am confident of this, that the one who began a good work in you will continue to complete it until the day of Jesus Christ. It is right for me to think this way about all of you because I hold you in my heart. For all of you are my partners in God's grace, both in my imprisonment and in the defense and confirmation of the gospel. For God is my witness how I long for all of you with the tender affection of Christ Jesus. And this is my prayer, that your love may overflow more and more with knowledge and full insight to help you determine what really matters, so that in the day of Christ you may be pure and blameless, having produced the harvest of righteousness that comes through Jesus Christ for the glory and praise of God. Now, when Christianity first began, it was not a highly regarded religion. It was considered this break-off sect of Judaism, and people used the word Christian as an epithet. It meant little Christs, little messiahs, little do-gooders over there, showing how important they are worshiping this crucified guy from the middle of nowhere. And the Philippian church, especially like in a Roman context, was even more derided. Paul had started this church in a city that was quite diverse, but also quite divided. Each group of people had their own wards that really kind of kept them from colliding with one another. And some of the wisdom that Paul is sharing is meant to help us in our own divided and diverse realities. He is writing from prison under house arrest from Roman authorities for preaching that Jesus is Lord, Christ, the anointed one, the king, and maybe not Caesar. And so we're not the same as this church Christians in our world have a little bit more power than this couple of dozen people in this large city. But we are in a reality where division seems to mark a lot of our society and where the church is often small and without much of a good reputation, or at least how it once was. And so the Philippians are worried. Paul is in prison, and they care about him and his well-being. But see, they also realize that having their founder in jail isn't the boost for the reputation that they were hoping for. It's not great publicity when the guy who founded your organization that already seems a little weird is now in prison. And in these moments of community crisis, there's a few options that we have. We can either shrink back, we can go to war with one another, or we can clarify who it is that we want to be. And that's what Paul's wisdom is that he doesn't want the Philippians to get downhearted and discouraged about where they are. He doesn't want them to begin clashing with one another and pointing fingers out of fear. Instead, he wants to use this moment of shameful embarrassment to help them clarify exactly who it is they are called to be. And he reminds them from the very beginning that they have been partners with Paul in this work that he was doing. This is a Greek word, koinonia. And it means fellowship, like how many churches have a fellowship hall. It's inspired from this word. But it's more than just being friendly or hanging out for coffee at the end of a service. This idea of partnership is not just being in business with one another, but it means to be bound together in this common purpose. The way we would use fellowship as in the fellowship of the ring. People committed to come together across their diverse experiences and races in order to see the ultimate good accomplished for the world. And as partners, as this fellowship, when one experiences a loss or a setback or an imprisonment, the idea is that the whole group does. And in the same way, when one finds joy and celebration, all of them find reasons to rejoice. And so Paul is saying, yeah, I get it. My circumstances, not ideal, but at least I get to write. At least I get to share my words, and it's actually through Paul's imprisonment that we have much of the New Testament. What he tells them is that while I am limited, you are not. That God is still working along this trajectory that has set you in motion from the day we began. That the one who began this good work in you will see it through to completion. It seems that the Philippian church has decided to continue their relationship with Paul by continuing to provide for him while he's in prison. Food and support and visits and everything else. They had really come through for him, even though they were a relatively poor church. They had collected money for the poor in Jerusalem as Paul was going through all these churches in this area, collecting money during his missionary travels. And so Paul is asking them in memory to consider their beginnings so they can anticipate even greater things to come. But he's not shy about also sharing his setbacks. In fact, he is quite vulnerable in this letter. He actually talks a lot like Paul does not talk in the rest of his letters to some of the other churches, where he says, "It is with tender affection that I long to be back with you, that I love this church in Philippi." He's gushing almost in his letter. That even in prison, though he's limited in how he can express his calling, he finds reason to rejoice. And this is part of this bold confession that he wants the Philippians to experience. That the circumstances that we interact with on a day-to-day basis may not always be the most ideal circumstances. And yet what we find is that God provides joy for us, no matter what. If we are willing to look, if we are willing to cultivate, if we are willing to notice, we might see the Spirit at work in ways that we otherwise might not experience. And so what Paul is embodying in writing this letter is an encouragement that those who would follow Christ would name their fears, would share with others what troubles them, would tell an embarrassing story or two. Not to deepen our shame, but instead to find that within these contexts, our hope shines the brightest. It is these kind of experience that really bind us together as a people. When I hear from you, whatever your middle school shame is, I've shared mine. But it's one of these things where it allows us to be together, really together, and not just in the same room. I mean, imagine if more people were brave enough to admit that they were afraid. Fear is one of the constants of our world today. And yet many of us try to put on a good face. You know, it's time for church, so we got to smile and fake it, through this reality. But instead, what if by naming our fears, not in order to stoke more panic, but to find a way forward together? Often we use our fears to justify our isolation or our rejection. We create scapegoats to focus our blame on. Right now, it's mostly transgender people, but in the past, it's been Muslim people or Jewish people or black people or Catholic people, whatever. But what if people would say in a confessional sort of way, I feel forgotten and aimless, unfulfilled in my work and uncertain about the future, rather than saying school librarians are crisis actors? It might be an opportunity for us to admit that we don't know what tomorrow holds and that we need help to take a step of faith. This is Paul's prayer that he would invite them to come to know God's grace in the midst of their shame, in the midst of their uncertainty. And that what has bound them in their fellowship together is Christ. He uses this memory of his as a way to shape the future. It's not this wistful nostalgia of wanting to go back to how it was, but instead seeing it trace a trajectory line and then anticipate where it might continue to go. And we can do the same thing in our own lives, looking back to see how God has been faithful to us and guiding us along a path, and then seeing how that path might still go. Now, this is coming from a guy that was terrible at catching fly balls, but still, you can trace a trajectory and consider how God might be moving. What Paul will say is that it seems that their minds have become misaligned from their hearts. That the love that they have found has been diminished because of their fear. And so he will say, my prayer is that your love will overflow with more and more knowledge so that you can learn what really matters. That this disconnect between your head and your heart, that fear and shame has occluded, might instead be reinvigorated as you remember how God has loved you and how you have loved well with one another. That it might reconnect and you can imagine a future that in spite of, or maybe because of, these present circumstances, we have a bright hope ahead of us. That they would discover how they might continue to be faithful to the promises that God had made for them back then, back to this foundation of grace. Because for Paul, what matters most is Christ and the transformation of a total way of life that orients itself to other people. He says, you have caught this inspired way of being in giving generously in support of him and the churches that he has helped to start. But now, because they have felt overwhelmed about the risks in front of them, they risk losing everything. I love asking people who are not actively involved in a church or other faith community about what they would want in a church if they could design one from scratch. That if they found something of value within it, what would that be? And what would they want to make sure were non-negotiables? And I like talking to them because their answers are so very different from people involved in church. Within the church, whenever I say, what are the things that are really important to you? The first instinct is to imagine church as a building or a thing that happens for an hour on Sunday. And so you'll hear the response of people of what those non-negotiables are, of certain hymns or instruments, or a sermon that is funny and profound and short and memorable and life-changing and short. Most people don't care about any of that. Most people over and over again tell me that what they want more than anything is community. It's a sense of being together. It's fellowship. It's partnership. It's a sense of a common mission that drives us forward and makes me feel like I belong, that gives me meaning and friendships that go through all the ups and downs that I experience. They want a place where they are loved and can love others. And it's this inward versus outward orientation, I think, that can be the hardest transformation to sustain. It's this strange paradox. We discover how much we matter when we decenter ourselves and stop making everything about us. It's not the way it should be. We would think if I just tell people, hey, I need a little bit more love here, look at me, that people would do that, but they don't. And instead, when we lay our own preferences down and instead discover what really matters, that it has nothing to do with hymns and sermons and pews and stained glass. And instead, it has a lot more to do with the stories that we share with one another and the ways that we pray for one another and the ways that we give our life over for a blessing for others. Paul's ultimate aim is the glory and the praise of God. And the aim of God is that all would come to know the transformative power of Christ that will turn us toward one another in love. And so we have this opportunity to consider, even this Memorial Day, to reflect and remember the people who gave of themselves so that we might find the life of Christ. And that we would consider these little moments of sacrifice that build a trajectory in our life that set us to soar. This is the kind of memory that Paul is evoking, of the sacrifices given to people who were brand new Christians and yet felt that in the saying yes to this call, that also meant saying yes to providing for Paul when he was in need, to still being friends with Paul when he was bringing shame upon the community, to still connecting with one another in spite of the insecurity of what lay ahead. It's important for us to remember our own stories and how we first discovered faith and how it began to transform us, how we've seen it transform the world around us. My hope is that we would be willing to trace that trajectory, looking back so that we might look forward, and that we might sense the new frontiers of faith that lay before us with gratitude as we connect and share and love one another. Amen.